What explains the strange connections between royal families that ruled as rivals but shared the same bloodlines, symbols, palace designs, and political traditions? From the Romanovs and Habsburgs to the Hanoverians and smaller German houses, their family trees often become far less clear just before these dynasties rise to power. At the same time, old maps still carried one enormous name across Eurasia: Tartary. So were these simply interconnected royal houses or remnants of something much older that later history split apart? Well, stay tuned to find out. Chapter 1. The Royal Bloodlines That Don't Add Up. When we began researching this topic, we weren't trying to pull apart centuries of accepted royal genealogy. We were simply following European marriages and seeing how families such as the Habsburgs, Romanovs, Tudors, and Hanoverians connected to one another. At first, it felt like ordinary research. One marriage led to another. One dynasty joined the next, and every branch seemed to fit neatly into place. But after spending enough time with those family trees, something started bothering us. Certain connections looked almost too convenient. We could follow one royal line backward with remarkable detail, then reach a woman who had married into that dynasty, follow her family for another generation or two, and suddenly, the certainty faded. That became difficult to brush aside because these families took ancestry incredibly seriously. Marriage among European royalty was rarely a casual affair. A bride could strengthen a claim to territory, end a political dispute, secure an alliance, or become the mother of a future king. Her family mattered. Her relatives mattered. Most importantly, her bloodline mattered. But several women entered powerful houses through minor noble families or German principalities that barely appear in the wider story of Europe. Before their marriages, their ancestry could become very difficult to follow. Afterward, everything changed. Their children were recorded, their titles established, their descendants carefully placed into royal genealogies. And what had once seemed uncertain became accepted without much hesitation. That contrast kept pulling us back. The Russian lines made the question even harder to ignore. The Romanovs belonged to one of the most examined dynasties in European history, surrounded by marriages, court records, noble families, and generations of political connections. But while following the families around them, references to Tatar ancestry begin appearing among parts of the Russian nobility. There is nothing impossible about that. Russian and Tatar peoples had centuries of contact, conflict, diplomacy, conversion, and marriage behind them. But another detail makes the subject irresistible. Older European maps once placed the enormous name Tartary across huge areas of Eurasia, while later maps gradually replaced that broad label with more specific political and geographical names. The similarity between Tatar and Tartary has inspired theories that go much further than the evidence allows, so we have to be careful here. Still, it raises a fascinating question about names themselves. How much of what we now treat as separate history was once described differently? And when political identities changed, how often did the family histories attached to them change as well? Then Britain gives us another curious turn. In 1714, George I of Hanover inherited the British crown through the Protestant line of succession. The reason is well documented, and there is nothing mysterious about the basic political process. What interested us was the world surrounding Hanover, a complicated network of German principalities, noble houses, marriages, changing titles, and closely connected families that repeatedly supplied husbands and wives to Europe's ruling dynasties. Follow those branches long enough, and the clean royal tree we started with begins looking much more like a maze. Perhaps every strange connection has an ordinary explanation. That remains entirely possible. But we kept returning to the same question, because it refused to leave us alone. These families guarded inheritance, legitimacy, and ancestry with extraordinary seriousness. They knew that one disputed parent could threaten a crown. So why, at certain crucial points, does the ancestry of the people entering those families become the hardest part of the story to follow? Chapter 2. The architecture that shouldn't match that question about royal families eventually led us somewhere we hadn't expected. We stopped looking only at names and marriages and began paying attention to what these rulers were building around themselves. That changed the direction of the research completely. St. Petersburg had the Winter Palace. London saw Buckingham Palace transformed on an enormous scale. Vienna had Schönbrunn Palace, while Madrid received a new royal palace after the old Alcazar burned in 1734. Different kingdoms, different rulers, different architects, yet they placed their great palaces beside one another, and the similarities become difficult to overlook. Officially, there is nothing unusual here. Baroque and later neoclassical ideas traveled throughout Europe, architects studied one another's work, and royal courts borrowed styles freely. We knew that going in. What kept our attention was how far the resemblance seemed to go. Similar proportions appear again and again, along with monumental columns, vast symmetrical fades, enormous interior spaces, repeating decorative patterns, and engineering carried out on a scale that demanded extraordinary planning and skilled labor. Naturally, we wanted to know who carried that knowledge from one court to another. The architects have names, careers, commissions, and biographies, so this is not a story of unknown builders suddenly appearing from nowhere. But following their professional circles reveals something far more interesting. European royal architecture was tied together by a remarkably connected world of designers, craftsmen, academies, patrons, and traveling specialists, and that left us with a different mystery than the one we expected. The family trees had already shown us how closely Europe's ruling houses were connected. Now their palaces seem to be telling a similar story in stone. Rival kingdoms may have fought over borders and crowns, but when they wanted to display power, they often spoke a similar architectural language. Once we noticed that connection, the buildings stopped feeling like background scenery. They became part of the story. Chapter 3. The empire that vanished from the maps once the palaces entered the picture. Our attention naturally moved beyond their walls. If royal families were connected across enormous distances, and their architecture carried familiar ideas from one capital to another, then the old maps deserved another look. That was where the story took a much stranger turn. Open European maps of Asia from the 17th and 18th centuries. French, Dutch, British, and one name appears so prominently that it is almost impossible to miss: Tartary. Sometimes it becomes Great Tartary, sometimes Tartaria, while other versions divide it into several Tartaries. Whatever the wording, the territory beneath that name covers an astonishing portion of Eurasia, reaching across Siberia and Central Asia toward China and the Pacific. At first, we assumed it was just an old geographical expression. In many respects, that is exactly how historians understand it. European mapmakers used Tartary broadly for lands associated with various Tatar, Turkic, Mongol, and other peoples whom Europeans often understood poorly. Yet the maps themselves kept pulling us back. Certain examples contain cities, regional divisions, routes, settlements, kingdoms, and references to rulers. The picture feels far more complicated than one enormous blank space marked with a convenient name. And then, gradually, Tartary begins disappearing. By the late 18th and 19th centuries, areas once carrying that broad designation increasingly appear beneath names connected with the Russian Empire, Qing China, Central Asian Khanates, and other better-defined regions. The land remains exactly where it always was. The terminology changes around it. What interested us was not the disappearance of a word by itself, but how dramatically our understanding of the same enormous region changes along with that word. If Tartary had been one unified empire, we would expect something very different from the surviving historical record. An empire covering such an immense area should leave behind recognizable rulers, central institutions, wars of succession, diplomatic archives, taxation systems, and accounts of its collapse. We do have extensive records for the Russian expansion across Siberia, the Qing conquest of territories farther east, and the many Khanates and peoples spread between them. That makes the claim of a single forgotten Tartarian superstate extremely difficult to support. But it does not make those old maps boring. Quite the opposite. They reveal how Europeans once pictured a part of the world that remained distant, complicated, and politically fragmented from their perspective. One label could cover people who did not necessarily consider themselves members of the same nation at all. Later, cartographers became increasingly specific, and the giant name slowly broke apart. Still, after everything we had already seen with royal ancestry and those strangely familiar palaces, watching such an enormous name fade from map after map felt almost eerie. Well, not because the maps prove a forgotten empire existed. Because they leave us with a better question: how can something occupy such a huge place in the geographical imagination of one century, then become almost unfamiliar to everyone living a few centuries later? We mean, isn't it weird? Chapter 4. Were these royal families actually connected? By this point, the question had moved well beyond old maps and palace walls. There was another place to look, one that earlier historians never had available to them. Modern genetics has changed what we know about ancestry. Ancient remains can now reveal migrations, unexpected relationships, and mixtures between populations once described as completely separate. That naturally left us wondering about the families at the center of this story. European royalty spent centuries preserving genealogies, defending legitimacy, arranging marriages around ancestry, and treating descent as the foundation of political authority. Yet there has never been one sweeping genetic project testing all of those royal lines against the family trees preserved in their archives. There have certainly been individual studies. Dina has even helped identify disputed royal remains, including members of the Romanov family. So the science itself is not absent from royal history. What remains missing is something far broader: a genetic comparison across several European dynasties, following paternal and maternal branches together and asking how closely the biological relationships match the documented ones. Perhaps there is a perfectly ordinary reason. Privacy alone would make such a project difficult. Still, considering how much royal identity has always depended on ancestry, the absence leaves an irresistible question behind. What would we actually learn if those families were examined together? Genetics has already taught us to be suspicious of old ideas about completely pure populations. People traveled, armies moved, merchants crossed continents, marriages joined distant communities. And ancestry rarely stayed inside the neat boundaries later drawn around nations. European monarchies were no exception. Their own marriage records show relatives moving constantly between courts. So finding Central Asian, Eastern European, Scandinavian, Mediterranean, or other ancestry in royal Dina would hardly expose a forgotten empire. What it could do is reveal connections that traditional family trees make easy to overlook. That thought brought us back to architecture, although this time from a different angle. Schönbrunn, the Winter Palace, Buckingham Palace, Madrid's Royal Palace, and other monumental residences belonged to separate courts, yet they often relied upon related European traditions of symmetry, proportion, ceremonial space, and classical design. Earlier we wondered whether this similarity suggested a deeper connection. There was one vital correction we had to make while following it: Resemblance does not mean identical engineering. Architects traveled, books circulated, craftsmen crossed borders, and wealthy patrons deliberately copied whatever projected authority most effectively. Even rival monarchs could admire the same artistic language, and perhaps that tells us something more interesting about the royal families themselves. Political enemies did not necessarily live in separate cultural worlds. They married one another, exchanged ambassadors, hired foreign specialists, spoke common diplomatic languages, and borrowed symbols freely. Their rivalry existed inside an unusually close international circle. Royal heraldry makes that circle even easier to recognize. The double-headed eagle appears in Byzantine tradition, the Holy Roman Empire, Imperial Russia, and later heraldic traditions elsewhere. It can feel remarkable when the same creature appears across distant courts, but the symbol was not independently invented every time. Rulers inherited, adapted, and deliberately borrowed older imperial imagery because symbols carried political meaning. Claiming connection with Rome or Byzantium could strengthen a dynasty's own sense of legitimacy. Lions, eagles, crowns, crosses, and particular heraldic arrangements traveled for similar reasons. So rather than proving one concealed royal house, these recurring emblems may show us how desperately rulers wanted to connect themselves with older authority. Then there is language. Royal marriages regularly placed princes and princesses in countries where the everyday speech was unfamiliar to them. That sounds strange until we remember that court life was multilingual. French became enormously important among European elites. Latin remained useful in scholarly, religious, and diplomatic settings, while German and other languages traveled through dynastic networks. Private letters could therefore move between languages depending on who was writing, who was reading, and what was being discussed. Still, something about all of this refuses to become ordinary. We began with separate royal families. Then we found marriages tying them together. Their palaces belonged to overlapping artistic traditions. Their symbols were borrowed from the same older sources. Their courts communicated through shared elite languages. Even the foreign prince or princess arriving from another kingdom was often entering a world already connected to their own through relatives. Tutors, diplomats, and marriage. Perhaps the real secret was never that these families belonged to one forgotten bloodline. Perhaps it is that they were far less separate than the borders on their maps make them appear. And once we start treating Europe's royal houses as one tightly connected network, rather than isolated dynasties, several things that seemed like coincidences begin to feel very different. Chapter 5. The Fires That Erased the Past. And that brings us to the part of this research that bothered us for a completely different reason. Royal ancestry can be debated. Old maps can be misunderstood. Symbols can travel between cultures. But every historical claim depends on records. And records have one weakness that bloodlines and stone buildings do not: they can disappear. Between the 17th and 19th centuries, fires struck palaces, libraries, government offices, churches, and private collections across Europe. Madrid's old Royal Alcazar burned in 1734, taking paintings and documents with it. Washington suffered its own destruction in 1814 when British troops burned government buildings and the Library of Congress lost its original collection. Other archives suffered damage through fires, wars, relocation, neglect, and later bombing. There is nothing extraordinary about fire itself. What stayed with us was something more personal. Once an original document is gone, everyone afterward has to depend on whatever survived, whatever was copied, and whoever made those copies. That changes the way we think about certainty. A reconstructed genealogy may be completely accurate, but it can never give us back the page that disappeared. A copied land register can preserve valuable information while still leaving us unable to compare it with the original. History continues, but part of its memory has already been filtered. Then our attention returned to Siberia, because the old maps from the previous chapter had left unfinished business there. European cartographers frequently placed Siberian territories beneath broad labels such as Tartary, even while Russian expansion eastward had already begun centuries earlier. By the 1700s, Russian authority across Siberia had become far stronger and far easier to recognize on European maps. That change was not instantaneous. Cossack expeditions, forts, tribute systems, trading routes, conflicts, negotiations, and settlements had been pushing eastward since the late 16th century. But the Siberia they encountered was certainly not empty. Indigenous peoples had their own political structures, trade networks, settlements, alliances, rivalries, and connections stretching across enormous distances. Russian accounts also described established towns and fortified places in parts of Central and Northern Asia. Later imperial expansion changed many of those communities so deeply that reading only the final version of the map can give us a misleading sense that Russian control had always been there. And perhaps this is where the 5 chapters finally meet. We began with royal genealogies because certain family connections raised questions. Those families led us toward palaces, and the palaces revealed how closely European courts shared artistic traditions. The maps then showed us how dramatically geographical language could change. Dina complicated old ideas of pure ancestry, while heraldry and court culture reminded us that separate dynasties constantly borrowed, married, corresponded, and competed within the same connected world. Finally, the archives showed us something simpler and perhaps more important. Our knowledge of any period is only as complete as the evidence that reaches us. Does that prove Tartary was a forgotten worldwide empire? No. Does it prove Europe's royal houses secretly descended from one concealed dynasty? Again, no. The evidence does not take us that far. But the journey leaves us somewhere more interesting than a simple yes or no. History is not an untouched account passed perfectly from century to century. It comes through surviving letters, maps drawn by outsiders, family records, archaeological remains, political documents, later copies, and people interpreting all of them. Every source gives us something, none gives us everything. So perhaps the final question is not whether everything we inherited is false. It is whether we have become too comfortable believing that everything important has already been found. Because sometimes the most revealing part of an old story is not what survives on the page. It is realizing how much of the conversation may no longer be there. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you soon.